The entire Alpha Pack was mourning 6 pups they believed had died beneath the snow. The fortress bells were ringing. Hundreds of wolves stood with their heads lowered. Even the Alpha King had lost hope. Then, through the blizzard, a barefoot woman appeared at the gates. Her clothes were torn. Her hands were bleeding.
They belonged to the
Snow
North.
covered her hair and face, but what
The
made
North
every
will
wolf
always
suddenly go
protect them.
silent was what she was carrying in her arms. The 6 pups everyone had mourned, alive. And when the wolves saw the rejected Omega standing there with their missing children, they did something no one in the kingdom had ever witnessed before. The bells of Wolfstone Fortress had never sounded like that before. They were not calling soldiers to the walls. They were not announcing a royal birth, a wedding, or the return of hunters from the northern mountains. They were mourning. One deep bell rolled across the valley. Then another. Then another. Each sound disappeared into the snow-covered forest, where the wind carried it between black pine trees and across frozen streams until even the distant mountain slopes seemed to answer with silence. Inside the fortress courtyard, hundreds of wolves stood beneath the falling snow. No one moved. Their white breath drifted into the cold air. Their ears were lowered. Their tails hung still. At the center of the courtyard rested 6 small wooden cradles covered with white cloth. They were empty. 6 tiny lives had vanished 3 days earlier during the worst mountain storm Frostmere had seen in 20 years. The pups had been playing near the eastern watchtower when the sky turned black. Snow had swallowed the mountainside within minutes. The guards had searched until their fingers bled from the cold. Hunters had followed tracks into the forest, only to find them buried beneath fresh snow. Then, that morning, they had discovered the paw prints. 6 sets of tiny prints. They had led toward a collapsed ravine. And stopped. There had been no tracks coming back. Alpha King Caelan stood at the head of the courtyard, motionless beneath a dark fur cloak. Snow had gathered across his shoulders. He had not brushed it away. His eyes remained fixed on the empty cradles. Beside him stood the pup's mother, Queen Seraphine, her face pale and wet with tears she no longer bothered to hide. The entire pack waited for Caelan to speak. But the king could not. His hand closed slowly around the silver pendant hanging at his chest. It had belonged to his eldest son. The smallest of the 6. The pup who had always fallen asleep against Caelan's foreleg. The pup who had once tried to climb the throne steps and tumbled backward into a basket of winter apples. That memory should have made Caelan smile. Instead, his jaw tightened. He looked toward the mountains. The storm was still there. A wall of white covering everything beyond the fortress. Somewhere beneath that snow, 6 little hearts had stopped beating. At least, that was what everyone believed. Far beyond the kingdom walls, where the fortress bells could barely be heard, a young woman sat alone beside a dying fire. Her name was Elara. She had no family. No home. No pack. The village of Briar Hollow had driven her out 6 months earlier. They had called her a weak Omega. A burden. A woman whose presence brought bad luck. When the village elders discovered that she could not shift like the other Omegas, they decided she had no place among them. They had left her belongings beside the road. A torn blanket. A wooden bowl. 2 old dresses. And a loaf of bread already hard from the cold. Elara had walked until she found an abandoned shepherd's hut deep in the western forest. It was little more than 4 stone walls and a roof that leaked whenever it rained. But it was shelter. And she had learned not to ask life for more than shelter. That night, the wind struck the walls so violently that the old wooden door trembled in its frame. Elara crouched beside the fire, rubbing her hands together. The flames were barely alive. She reached for another piece of wood. Then stopped. She heard something. At first it sounded like the wind. A thin sound. Almost too faint to notice. She leaned closer to the door. There it was again. A cry. Not human. Small. Broken. A whimper carried through the storm. Elara's eyes narrowed. She listened. Another cry came from somewhere beyond the hut. Then another. Her heart began beating faster. She knew what sensible people did during a blizzard. They stayed inside. They locked the door. They waited for morning. But the sound came again. A tiny, desperate cry. Elara stood. She wrapped her old cloak around herself and opened the door. Snow rushed into the hut. The wind nearly knocked her backward. For a moment she could see nothing. Only white. White sky. White ground. White trees bending beneath the weight of the storm. Then she heard it again. To the east. Elara stepped into the snow. Her bare feet disappeared almost immediately. She flinched at the cold but kept walking. One step. Then another. The cries became louder. She crossed a narrow path between the trees, following the sound until she reached a slope where the snow had collapsed inward. Something had happened there. Elara dropped to her knees. She began digging. The snow was packed hard. Her fingers quickly became numb. She used a broken branch. Then her hands again. Blood appeared beneath her fingernails. She did not stop. A few minutes later, the branch struck wood. Elara froze. She cleared the snow away. A narrow opening appeared. Behind it was darkness. And warmth. Not much. But enough to feel. She crawled inside. The cave was almost completely buried. And at the far end, beneath a fallen wooden beam, 6 tiny bodies were pressed together. 6 wolf pups. Alive. Their fur was stiff with ice. Their eyes were barely open. One lifted its head when Elara approached. It gave the weakest cry she had ever heard. Elara covered her mouth. She had no idea who they belonged to. She did not know they were royal. She did not know the entire kingdom believed them dead. She only saw 6 frightened creatures slowly freezing beneath the mountain. So she crawled closer. She lifted the first pup. Then the second. Then the third. By the time she reached the 6th, her arms were shaking. She wrapped them all against her chest. And just as she looked toward the cave entrance, the mountain groaned. A deep sound rolled beneath the earth. Snow began pouring through the opening. The storm had found them. Elara held the pups tighter. For the first time that night, she understood the truth. Finding them had been the easy part. Getting them home might cost her everything. Elara stepped back into the storm before dawn. She had tied the pups together beneath her cloak, using strips of cloth torn from the bottom of her dress. The smallest one rested against her chest. Its breathing was so faint that she kept touching its nose to make sure it was still alive. Every time she felt the tiny warmth against her palm, she kept moving. The snow reached her knees. Sometimes her thighs. The wind pushed against her with enough force to make walking feel like climbing a wall. But Elara continued. She had no map. No horse. No food except half a piece of dried bread. She did not even know exactly where the kingdom fortress stood. She only knew that wolf pups this large could not belong to ordinary hunters. Their fur was too clean. Their collars were too fine. One carried a small silver clasp around its neck, engraved with a symbol she had never seen before. A wolf beneath a crown. Elara glanced at it once. Then she tucked it beneath the cloak. It did not matter who they were. They were alive. That was enough. Hours passed. The storm erased every footprint behind her. At midday, one of the pups stopped moving. Elara dropped to her knees. No. Her voice disappeared beneath the wind. She opened her cloak. The little pup lay still against her chest. Elara pressed both hands around its body. She rubbed its frozen ears. She breathed warm air against its face. Nothing. Then, barely noticeable, its ribs moved. A tiny breath. Elara closed her eyes. She held the pup against her bare skin beneath her torn dress. The cold bit through her immediately. But she did not move. She remained there until the pup's breathing became steadier. Then she stood again. The forest slowly opened ahead. And Elara saw the bridge. It crossed a frozen river between 2 steep banks. If she reached it, she could save hours of walking. She stepped onto the first wooden plank. The bridge groaned. Elara stopped. The river beneath it was not completely frozen. Dark water moved beneath sheets of ice. She took another step. The bridge shook. Then the rope on the far side snapped. The entire structure tilted. Elara grabbed the railing. The pups cried beneath her cloak. She twisted her body, protecting them. Wood shattered. She fell. Her shoulder struck the river bank. For several seconds she could not breathe. Then she heard the pups. Alive. She pulled herself up. The bridge had collapsed behind her. The river roared between the two banks. The fortress was somewhere beyond it. Elara looked at the water, then at the pups. She had no choice. She walked along the river until darkness fell. Eventually she found a fallen pine whose branches created a narrow shelter above the snow. She crawled beneath it. The wind could not reach them as easily there. Elara broke the remaining bread into 6 pieces. Each pup received one. She kept nothing. When the smallest pup finished eating, it crawled beneath her chin and fell asleep. Elara smiled for the first time in days. She whispered a prayer to no one in particular. Then she closed her eyes. Far away, at Wolfstone Fortress, the mourning ceremony had begun. 6 small stones had been placed before the ancient altar. Caelan stood before them. The pack gathered behind him. Queen Seraphine lowered her head. The bells rang again. A healer carried a bowl of ashes toward the altar. But before the ceremony could continue, one of the older wolves lifted its head. Its ears pointed toward the mountains. A second wolf followed. Then a third. Soon the entire courtyard was listening. Caelan looked toward the northern forest. Nothing moved. Yet the wolves heard something. Not a voice. Not a howl. Something smaller. Something carried by the wind. Then the oldest wolf in the pack released a long, mournful howl. Another answered. Then another. The sound spread through the valley. It was not a hunting call. It was a call for family. Meanwhile, beneath the fallen pine, Elara woke. The wolves were howling. She sat up slowly. For a moment she listened. Then she understood. They were searching. The pups began moving beneath her cloak. One raised its head. Another whimpered. Elara looked toward the mountains. The howls were coming from there. She gathered the pups into her arms and began walking toward the sound. She did not know that the wolves she was walking toward were already searching for her. Morning arrived without sunlight. The sky remained grey, and the snow had turned the entire forest into a world without edges. Elara walked until her legs trembled. The pups were warmer now. That gave her strength. Then she heard horses. She stopped. The sound came from behind the trees. Hooves. Metal. Several riders. Elara's heart tightened. She moved behind a pine and pulled the pups close. 6 horses emerged from the snow. Their riders wore dark leather armor beneath heavy cloaks. At their center rode a tall man with silver hair and a narrow scar across his cheek. Lord Varrick. He had spent 20 years inside Wolfstone Fortress. He had served kings. He had advised generals. And he had waited patiently for Caelan's weakness. The disappearance of the pups had been his design. He had ordered a servant to lure them toward the eastern mountain path. He had arranged for the storm to destroy the tracks. He had expected the mountain to finish what he started. Now the pups were alive. And Varrick had come to correct that mistake. His eyes fell on Elara. Then on the bundle beneath her cloak. Stop. Elara did not move. One soldier dismounted. He reached toward her. She stepped backward. The pups. His hand moved toward the cloak. Elara tightened her arms. No. The soldier stared at her. Varrick looked more carefully. Then recognition flickered across his face. An Omega. Alone. Weak. Exactly what he needed. He smiled without warmth. He told his men that the woman had stolen royal property. Elara did not understand the accusation. She only understood that these men wanted the creatures she had nearly died protecting. She backed away again. The smallest pup began to whimper. A soldier grabbed Elara's wrist. She fought. Not strongly. Not gracefully. But desperately. She sank her teeth into the man's glove and tore free. He raised his hand. Before it could strike, the wolves began howling. The sound came from the ridge. Varrick turned. His face changed. A line of wolves stood above them. Dozens. White fur against white snow. Their eyes fixed on the riders. Then a larger figure appeared behind them. A black horse emerged from the storm. Caelan sat upon it. His cloak whipped behind him. His eyes moved from Varrick to Elara. Then stopped. The world seemed to become silent. Caelan saw the pups. Alive. His body went completely still. For one heartbeat he did not breathe. Then he dismounted. Queen Seraphine was not with him. He had come alone. Perhaps some part of him had needed to see the impossible with his own eyes. He stepped closer. One of the pups lifted its head. Caelan's expression broke. The king reached forward. But the pup did not go to him. It turned toward Elara. Pressed its face against her chest. Caelan stopped. Pain crossed his face. Then something else. Confusion. The wolves surrounding him began lowering their heads. One after another. Elara looked around, frightened. She did not understand why. Caelan did. Or at least he knew something was wrong. The wolves were not bowing to him. They were bowing to her. He looked at the young woman standing barefoot in the snow. Her hair was frozen against her cheeks. Her hands were bleeding. Her cloak was torn. Yet she was still holding all 6 pups. Caelan took another step. "Bring them to me." His voice was quiet. Elara hesitated. Then she slowly moved forward. Caelan reached for the smallest pup. The moment his fingers touched its fur, he noticed something red. Blood. Fresh blood. Not hers. Not from the storm. Caelan's eyes hardened. He examined the pup's side. There was a tiny wound beneath its fur. An arrow graze. His gaze lifted toward Varrick. The advisor had gone pale. Caelan looked at the soldiers. Then at the blood. Then at the 6 pups. The storm had not taken his children. Someone had hunted them. And that someone was still standing among them. The gates of Wolfstone Fortress opened before noon. For the first time in 3 days, the morning bells stopped. People gathered along the walls as Caelan entered with the pups. Elara walked behind him. She expected chains. Instead, she found hundreds of wolves staring at her. Some approached cautiously. Others stayed back. But every pair of eyes followed the woman who had walked through the blizzard carrying 6 royal children. Queen Seraphine ran into the courtyard. She nearly fell when she saw the pups. One by one, she touched them, counted them, held them. Then she pressed her face against their fur. Tears disappeared into white coats. The pups were alive. That fact seemed too beautiful for the fortress to understand. But when Seraphine reached for the smallest pup, it squirmed free. It crawled back toward Elara. The queen stopped. She looked at Elara. There was no jealousy in her expression. Only gratitude. "Let her stay." Those were the first words anyone spoke. The healers carried the pups inside. Elara followed. They cleaned the wounds. Wrapped the smallest in warm cloth. Fed them broth made from goat milk and herbs. The pups slept. But every time Elara tried to step away, one woke. By evening, all 6 were asleep against her. Elara sat beside the fire. One pup rested across her lap. Another slept against her ankle. Caelan stood in the doorway watching. He had never seen his children trust a stranger so quickly. He asked where she had found them. Elara explained. She told him about the cave. The fallen beam. The storm. The bridge. The night beneath the pine. Then she told him something that made Caelan's expression change. She had heard them before she saw them. Their cries had called her. Caelan looked toward the old healer. The healer's face had gone pale. She asked Elara to place her hand against the oldest pup's head. Elara did. The pup relaxed instantly. The healer stared at Elara's wrist. There, beneath the skin, a faint silver mark had appeared. A crescent surrounded by tiny lines. The same symbol carved into the oldest stones beneath the fortress. The healer whispered that it belonged to the Omega Guardians. A bloodline believed extinct for 300 years. Elara pulled her hand away. She knew nothing about guardians. She only knew that her mother had once told her never to ask about the silver mark on her wrist. Her mother had died when Elara was young. And after that, the village had called the mark cursed. Caelan began asking questions. Who had raised her? Who had taught her about wolves? Why could she hear the pups? Why had her village rejected her? Elara could answer only some of them. But one truth became clear. Her rejection had not been simple. Years earlier, Someone had spread rumors that Elara carried a dangerous bloodline. Someone had convinced the elders that she was weak. Someone had wanted her forgotten. Before Sir Ellen could investigate further, glass exploded across the chamber. A poisoned arrow struck the wall. Everyone froze. The shaft trembled. A black substance dripped from its tip. Sir Ellen moved between the arrow and the pups. A guard pulled it free. Something was carved into the wood. A symbol. The same wolf beneath a crown. One of the pups woke. It looked at the arrow. Its tiny ears flattened. Then it growled. Not at the soldiers. Not at Sir Ellen. At the symbol. A low sound came from its throat. Sir Ellen stared. Because the pup had never growled at that symbol before. And suddenly the king understood something far worse than betrayal. The enemy was not outside the fortress. The enemy knew exactly where they were. Sir Ellen summoned the council before midnight. Varrick arrived wearing the same calm expression he had worn for 20 years. But the king had changed. The grief that had weakened his face was gone. In its place was something colder. The poisoned arrow lay on the table. The symbol faced upward. Varrick claimed ignorance. He said anyone could have carved it. Sir Ellen did not answer. He simply ordered the guards to search the advisors' quarters. Before they could leave, a horn sounded from the western wall. Then another. Then screams. The fortress gates were opening. Sir Ellen turned. Varrick smiled. For the first time, there was no disguise left on his face. He had planned everything. The outer gate lifted. Snow rushed through the courtyard. Behind it came wolves from the mountain range. Wild. Starving. Terrified. Men had driven them toward the fortress with fire and spears. They were not attacking because they wanted blood. They were attacking because they had nowhere else to go. The courtyard erupted into chaos. Guards raised weapons. The royal wolves charged. Elara heard the pups crying. She ran toward them. But the 6 pups were not looking at the battle. They were looking at the floor. One began scratching at the stone. Then another. Elara followed. Beneath an old staircase, she found a narrow doorway. The stone was covered with the same silver symbol on her wrist. The pups squeezed through. Elara followed. The passage descended beneath the fortress. At the bottom was a chamber untouched by time. Ancient paintings covered the walls. Wolves surrounded a woman. An omega. She held a wounded pup against her chest while an alpha stood behind her. Above them was the same silver crescent. Elara touched the carving. A strange warmth moved through her fingers. She understood. The old stories had never been about power. They had been about protection. The Omega Guardians had been chosen because they could calm frightened wolves, sense their pain, and lead them away from violence. The royal bloodline had survived because of them. Elara looked at the 6 pups. They had not chosen her because she was strong. They had chosen her because she stayed. Because she heard them. Because she refused to leave them in the snow. Above them, the battle grew louder. Elara returned to the courtyard. She saw several mountain wolves trapped beneath fallen timber. They were snarling at everyone. Guards prepared to kill them. Elara ran toward them. She lowered herself. Ignored the weapons. Ignored the snarling. She crawled slowly across the snow. One frightened wolf snapped at her. She stopped. Did not retreat. She waited. The wolf's breathing slowed. Its ears lowered. Elara reached forward. Her fingers touched its nose. The wolf went still. Then it lowered its head. The other wolves followed. The attack stopped. Sir Ellen stared from across the courtyard. But Varrick did not. He saw the same thing the ancient kings had feared. A woman who could unite wolves. A woman who could become more powerful than any advisor. He seized her when the fortress lights went dark. A cloth covered her mouth. Her arms were bound. The pups were taken. Varrick carried them toward the mountain gate. He intended to use them as bait. And Elara as the weapon he could blame for their deaths. When Sir Ellen discovered the empty chamber, he found only one thing behind. Elara's torn cloak. He picked it up. Snow was still melting into the fabric. The king closed his fist around it. Then he looked toward the mountains. The same mountains where he had lost his children. The same mountains where the storm had nearly taken Elara. This time, he would not let either of them disappear. He called the Alpha Pack. Hundreds of wolves gathered. And before dawn, they entered the storm. The mountain pass was almost impossible to cross. Snow reached the wolves' shoulders. Wind screamed between the cliffs. Caelan rode at the front until the path became too narrow for horses. Then he continued on foot. The Alpha Pack followed. Their paws disappeared into snow. Their breath filled the darkness. They found Varrick's tracks near sunrise. But they also found blood. Not human. Pup blood. Caelan's face went white. He followed the trail faster. The tracks led toward a ruined stone sanctuary built into the mountain. Inside, Varrick had gathered his men. The 6 pups were trapped in a wooden cage. Elara was tied against a pillar. Varrick stood before them. He had expected Caelan. He had planned for him. He wanted the king to arrive desperate and angry. He wanted the royal wolves to attack. Then he would kill the pups and claim that Elara had caused the deaths. The kingdom would turn against the Omega. The king would lose his authority. And Varrick would take the throne. But Varrick had forgotten one thing. The pups knew the old sanctuary. Or perhaps their blood remembered it. The smallest began scratching the stone floor. Elara looked down. There. Beneath the dust. The silver crescent. She pulled against the ropes. The stone shifted. A narrow crack opened. Cold air rushed through. An old tunnel. Elara pulled harder. The rope cut into her wrists. But she kept going. The pups began whining. She reached through the opening. One pup crawled toward her. Then another. One by one, she guided them into the tunnel. Varrick shouted. His men ran toward them. But the passage was too narrow. Elara crawled behind the pups. The tunnel led upward. Toward an ancient chamber beneath the sanctuary. A chamber filled with old carvings. A hidden escape route used by the Omega Guardians. Elara reached the end. The stone door opened into the sanctuary courtyard. Caelan stood there. For 1 second, neither moved. Then Elara released the pups. They ran. Caelan dropped to his knees. 6 small bodies crashed into him. He gathered them against his chest. His eyes closed. The first tears fell. Behind him, the wolves filled the courtyard. Varrick emerged from the sanctuary. He was surrounded by his own soldiers. He demanded that they obey him. No one moved. One soldier lowered his weapon. Then another. They had seen the pups. They had seen the ancient markings. And they had found documents inside Varrick's chambers proving he had ordered their disappearance. His plan collapsed in silence. The man who had wanted the kingdom through fear discovered that fear had finally abandoned him. Caelan stood. The wolves surrounded Varrick. But the king did not kill him. He ordered him taken back to Frostmere to face judgment before the entire kingdom. Varrick's reign of manipulation ended not with blood, but with the truth. And Elara stood beside the pups. Her hands were still bleeding. Her dress was torn. Snow clung to her hair. Yet something inside her had changed. She no longer stood like someone waiting to be rejected. She stood like someone who had finally found where she belonged. Spring came slowly to Frostmere. The snow melted from the rooftops. Streams returned to the valleys. Green grass appeared around Wolfstone Fortress. The 6 pups grew stronger every week. They followed Elara everywhere. Through the gardens. Across the courtyard. Into the kitchens. Sometimes they slept outside her door. Sometimes they climbed onto her bed before sunrise. The wolves of the fortress accepted her completely. Not because Caelan ordered them to. Because they remembered. They remembered the woman who had walked barefoot through a blizzard. The woman who had given her last piece of bread to 6 creatures she did not know. The woman who had held a dying pup against her skin until its heartbeat strengthened. One evening, Elara stood on the hillside above the fortress. The valley below was green. The mountains were no longer white. Caelan approached quietly. For a while, he said nothing. He looked toward the pups playing among the flowers. Then toward the wolves resting nearby. Elara smiled. She was no longer afraid of the silence. Caelan stood beside her. The king who had once believed grief would consume him had learned something during that terrible winter. Some people entered your life by blood. Others entered by choice. And sometimes the person who saves your family is the person everyone else once decided was worthless. Elara looked down at the valley. The 6 pups raced toward her. She knelt. They climbed over her arms, knocking her backward into the grass. Her laughter carried across the hillside. The wolves lifted their heads. One by one, they walked toward her. Then the Alpha Pack lowered their heads. Not in mourning. Not in fear. In gratitude. Elara placed one hand against the largest wolf's forehead. The animal closed its eyes. Behind them, the fortress bells began to ring. This time they were not announcing death. They were announcing spring. And as sunlight poured over Frostmere, the woman who had once walked alone through the snow was no longer alone. She had a family. She had a home. And 6 little wolves who would never forget the night she carried them out of the darkness.